to do this, and so I thought that I would approach it this way. All of you are psychology majors, and we push that psychology is a science. And I argue, in fact, the name of our department, after hundreds of years at Tarleton State University, we finally got our own department, and we decided the most appropriate name would be psychological sciences. And again, what that does for me is that emphasizes the science part of what we do. And that's not to degrade or downgrade any other aspects that are covered under the umbrella of psychology, but we'll stick with the idea that psychology is a science, and really in the same vein as biology and chemistry and geology and those things. Although my colleagues in biological sciences would argue that, that's my story and I'm sticking with it. So, with that said, somebody's notifying me the Astros lost again last night. So with that said, I thought I would go back and do sort of how we got to where we are today. And so the way I want to start this is I want to go back to classical Greek. And so I want to ask y'all a question. Do you feel like that you've got knowledge somewhere in your head? Yes, no, I don't care. Okay. Where did it come from? Huh?
Experience.
Well, that's a potential answer. But I wanted to start this way is because the ancient Greek philosophers, that was pretty much what the philosophical topic was back in the day. What is knowledge and where exactly does it come from? And so with that said, there were lots of philosophers. I guess I'll just throw this guy out. He wasn't in my notes, but it's always good talk. One of them was Socrates. And all the ones that I'm going to mention were really teacher, student, teacher. And so they really followed each other at the, I forgot what the place where all these people taught. So the first one was Socrates. And what I really like for you to know about Socrates was what his method of instruction was. What his goal was to challenge what people think. So if you thought you knew something, like he might ask you a question and say something like, what exactly is sexual assault on women? And so you would give an answer. And then he would challenge that answer. He would ask you another question. He'd say something like, well, if that's true, then what about da-da-da-da-da? And then you would answer that. And then he'd come back and ask you another question. And so this method of teaching was called the Socratic method. And there was a faculty member at good old John Tarleton that taught history that way. She would come in and ask questions and then ask questions based upon your answer and so forth and so on. Well, what happened was, as far as Socrates was individually concerned, his method of instruction and the way that he attracted followers got him crosswise with the, I guess, government of Athens. The people that ran Athens didn't like what Socrates was doing. And one of the things that he was doing, he was collecting all the young men in Athens, and in their parents' position, or in probably their father's position, was screwing with their mind. Very much like, I don't know what y'all's political beliefs are today. The governor of Texas said that something about nasty liberal faculty members at universities. They, like, just put us all in one great big category and said we were scum-sucking dogs or something, because we were liberal faculty members. Well, that was kind of what was happening back in ancient Athens. That people thought Socrates was somehow or another messing with the minds of all the young guys in Athens, and so they told him to stop, and he wouldn't. And then they said, okay, we're going to make you leave Athens. And he had been born and raised in Athens, and he didn't want to do that, so he said, I'm not going to do that either. And then they said, okay, well, if you're not going to quit and you're not going to leave, then you're going to drink this poison. And so he said, okay, I'll do that. And so he took the hemlock. And I mean, they said they're going to put him to death. And he said, well, I guess that's what will have to happen because I don't want to leave. So he drank the hemlock, and then as he died, he described to his followers what was going on in his body as he began to die of this hemlock. So that's one of two important things in my mind about Socrates. The second thing was one of his students, in fact probably his prime student, was a philosopher known as Plato. And so let's talk about Plato for a little bit. Now I want to go back to this knowledge business.
Wait, can I stop for just a second?
Sure.
If you ask me to take hemlock, because I can somehow mess with people's heads, I'm not going to do that. I don't care that much. So I would not describe how it feels when I die to my students, because I love y'all, but I don't love you that much.
He's always about passing knowledge. So it's like,
I don't think I would have. I think I'd have left Athens.
I think that's a little bit easier choice
I don't care about
than to
Stephenville
describe the
that much.
poisoning process. Yeah.
I don't care about Texas that much. I hate to say this. I don't care about the United States that much. I'll abandon ship. But for whatever reason, Socrates, and we have no idea. All we've got is descriptions of what life was like back, I don't know, 300 or 400 BC. So we don't know what it was really like. We don't know what it was like outside the cities. And I'm not even sure we could call Athens a city. But if you got banished out into the outback, we don't know exactly what that was like out there. And it might have been very unsafe to do that, and to move to, and word had to travel, so he probably also knew, okay, if I leave Athens and I go to, let's say, Sparta, they don't know about that. The word has gotten that this idiot's coming down there and going to mess with the minds of all your young men, and so I don't know why he thought what he did, but
didn't he not want to take his sons away from Athens too, because he got his education there?
As far as I know, he just did not. He'd been, I don't know, it's like a lot of people that I've lived in Stephenville for a long time, and I know a lot of people who have been born and raised in Stephenville, and they don't want to go anywhere else. I know this guy that he sponsored the high school choir to a trip to New York City, and he hated it the whole time he was there because it was not like Stephenville. And I would go, Mike, there's this, I don't care about that. I just like Jake and Dorothy's. And, so, but for whatever reason, that's what Socrates did. All right, so back to this knowledge stuff. So one of the questions was, what exactly is knowledge? Where does it come from? And one of the answers that these early philosophers knew about were your senses. Now, they had no idea how they worked, but they did know that you saw things and you heard things and you could taste things and you could feel things and smell things. So they knew about the senses. And so one possibility was that knowledge came from your senses. Plato, however, did not believe that. He believed that the senses presented you with false information. That you could, I'm not sure this is right, but I'll throw it out anyway. Your senses provided you more of opinion, but it wasn't truth. And one of the most boring passages you would ever have to read, and I know it because I assigned you guys the passage in my class, is the allegory of the caves.
I love it though.
Now I would rather drink hemlock than read that. But let's talk about the allegory of the cave. What Plato describes and what he's trying to do is to illustrate what he means about opinion and truth and so forth. And so he makes this description, and he says basically what's going on is there's a group of prisoners that are chained inside of a cave facing a wall. And they can't get up and they can't move. All they can do is sit and look at this wall. Behind them, somewhere, is a fire. And this fire is obviously casting light. And so on this wall that they're looking at, they can see the reflections of things And so there are events, there are objects that are passing back and forth between the prisoners' backs and the fire. So all they can see then is the shadow. So everything they know, knowledge, is not truth, because all they have to go on are their senses, and all their senses respond to are the shadows cast by the fire. So like triangleness, they don't know exactly the concept of triangleness. All they can do is look at the shadows of triangles on the wall. Okay, so if that, does that make any sense whatsoever? All right, so what do you have to do? What has to happen if you are to gain knowledge? Well, according to Plato, a philosopher or a teacher has to, let's just use the allegory. A philosopher or teacher has to go to one of these prisoners, unshackle them, and walk them out of the cave into the light. And when they get to the light, when they get outside, then they can see the objects as they really are. But the only way to do that is through philosophical discourse and instruction. You can't do it on your own. You've got to be taught by somebody. And so Plato really kind of presented, and I want y'all to kind of remember this, it's almost dualistic, that what you can learn on your own is only going to be opinion, but that there is truth out there. And you can be guided to the truth, but you have to be guided by a philosopher who has been there, who knows what truth is. And somehow right now I'm reminded about the passage that's written on the tower at the University of Texas that says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And that's almost something that Plato would have argued. All right, so anyway, that was in a nutshell is what Plato believed. In order to know what true knowledge was, you would have to go through philosophical discussions with a teacher and be led to that point so that you would know what actual truth is. All right, one of Plato's students was Aristotle. And unlike his teacher, Aristotle had more confidence in the senses. I don't remember that Aristotle really disagreed with the big concept that Plato had established, that there were, I'm just going to keep going with, there was a concept called the triangle. And the way you recognize triangles in day-to-day existence is because you compare them with the master triangle somewhere in your memory. Okay, so I'm not sure Aristotle disagreed with that, but what he did disagree on was the only way that you can get information in your day-to-day activities is to rely upon your senses. And so Aristotle was one of the first philosophers to classify objects. So that god-awful thing that you have to do in biology, that these are fish and these are mammals and these are birds and all that kind of stuff. This is not as good a bird as that bird is because that bird can fly but this bird can't, and you can go through all that kind of business. Well, Aristotle was one of the first people to actually try to classify biological objects into different categories. And again, his importance was on the senses. Now, I'm going to jump forward real quickly to today. When you take research, I suppose that Dr. Falkenberry or somebody would have told you that our method of science is empirical and it's based on observation. And so if I want to do some kind of experiment, I'm going to observe what goes on. I'm going to collect data, but it's pretty much all based on what I can see, taste, smell, so forth and so on. So it's very I don't know if I can do this. It's based on Aristotle. I was going to try to say Aristotelian. I knew it was going to come out wrong. So it's based on Aristotle. All right, so historically we go along like this for a while, and if you remember your ancient history, the Greeks were eventually overrun by this new group that lived in a little city on the Italian boot, and they were called Romans, and they eventually pretty much took over the Western world. And these two philosophies were carried over into the Roman Empire. At some point, well, if you've grown up in a church, you probably could throw dates on here. Somewhere between 0 and 33 AD, another kind of philosophy began to develop based upon the teachings of Jesus. And I've forgotten dates, but in probably 200 or 300 AD, the Roman Empire, the military thing, the governmental part, fell. Finally collapsed in upon itself because it was overextended. I mean, if you think about the distance between London, England, and Rome, Italy, and you think about the fact the only way to get between one to the other was either horseback or walking or maybe a wagon, and that was probably a several-day, month trip. But that gives you an idea of how far, at least that direction, the Roman Empire extended. Well, anyway, the empire collapses. One of the Caesars or one of the leaders of Rome turns Christian, and so the Roman Empire adopts the Christian church. And what we call that church today is the Catholic Church, because it was the Holy Roman. I'm not a Catholic, so I'm going to screw this up. But it's called Roman Catholicism. I do know that, and it was the church basically took over the ruling of the Roman Empire. All right, the early Christians had both Aristotle and Plato at their disposal. Now let's talk about Christianity, particularly probably Christianity in the 1st and 2nd century AD. Life on earth, I mean, it was a dualistic deal. You had heaven and all the things associated with God, and you had earth. And earth, your day-to-day activities tended to be lumped into the not-so-good stuff, but that it wasn't going to be bad because when you died, you went to heaven, and that's where all the cool stuff was. And that's what I remember from being raised in the First Baptist Church of Corpus Christi, Texas. Anyway. Which of those two philosophies, Plato's or Aristotle's, would fit more neatly into that Christian belief? What do you think?
What was the Christian belief again?
The heaven and earth.
Okay.
And earth was not necessarily good.
Probably Plato's, right?
Absolutely Plato's. Plato's philosophy got adopted into the early Christian church. I'm sure there's some religious word for this. There was a meeting in the 400s where a lot of things were codified. And since I look at a lot of your women, one of the codifications is that women could not be priests, women couldn't do this, women couldn't do that, women couldn't do this, women couldn't do that. And even though the story of Jesus had all these interactions between Jesus and all these different women, this meeting in 400 just erased all that and reinterpreted things to fit a male's point of view. And so if you're ever wondering where all that got started, that's where it all got started. But they also adopt Plato's philosophy. And one of the byproducts of this is that Aristotle's disappeared. And I'm not saying this is a cause and effect, I'm just recounting what happened. After a while, Europe began to slide into what we refer to as the Dark Ages. And it could be that one of the reasons why it slid into the Dark Ages is there was no scientific inquiry because Plato's theory had been adopted and not Aristotle's. So how do we know about Aristotle, you ask? Well, we know about Aristotle because those people that we refer to as Muslims, back in the day they were Arabic. They took all of the writings that were in the library in Alexandria, Egypt, and other places, and they saved all those things. And so Aristotle and Plato, but Aristotle for this class survived, the writings survived because the Arabic scholars saved all that business and wouldn't let it be destroyed, whereas the Christian scholars would have destroyed it. So that's how, and then what event took place that reacquainted us with all that stuff? People in the Middle East still talk about this. ISIS talked about this all the time. In fact, this is one of the motivations for ISIS being ISIS. And I'm talking, folks, it's almost 1,000 years old. It happened almost 1,000 years ago, and they still talk about it pissily.
The Renaissance?
Before the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a byproduct of this. I'll give you a hint. There was a guy named Richard the Lionhearted.
Oh, the Crusade.
The Crusade, there you go. Our forefathers thought they were cooler than the Arabs, and so they went back to take Jerusalem back from the Arabs, because by God, that's God's city, and God was a Christian, and so we're going to take it back. And so I don't know how long they fought that crap, but I'm telling you, if you'll go look at, I know you probably don't want to do this because the U.S. government might jump on you, but if you were to look at ISIS's writings, I guarantee you, Osama bin Laden was always talking about getting back because of the getting back for the Crusades. It's something that some of those people have been pissy about for thousands of years. But anyway, that's how our ancestors reacquainted themselves with the writings of Aristotle and other philosophers, because they had been saved, and then our crusaders reacquainted that stuff. So now we get this new information moving into Europe. And in Italy, actually I believe the start of this whole deal was Florence, Italy. You had what became known as the Renaissance. And so this was an awakening, an intellectual, an artistic, all kinds of awakening. And this led to a re-interest in scientific inquiry. This is when all the universities were started. Next time you go to graduation and you see Dr. Roberts and I dressed up in our monkey suits, those things are a direct descendant of the robes that monks wore when they taught classes at these early universities. So we got the robe, we got the cap, we got the whole rigmarole, that thing that goes down the back, our backs. They're all colorful. It's got a little hole in it, because that's what the hood that used to be worn by these monks. And if you wanted to pay us for your education, for us educating you, you can drop food and stuff down in the little. That's the way that they rewarded the monks in those early universities. They would drop food or money or something in their hoods that were down off their head and left a little pocket back there.
It'd make your education a lot cheaper, right? You just drop some food in the hood.
But that is the genesis. That's the genesis of the academic gowns that we wear. That's where all that stuff came from. Okay, so I saw this. I could throw this in this class too. In the 1300s, rats migrated via ships from the Middle East to like Italy and along those coastal areas because of trade. Well, these rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried the Black Plague. And so you had massive amounts of death all through Europe. Now, I was watching something on TV the other day, and in Romania, they ran out of room in the cemetery. And so what they would do is they would go dig somebody up so they could put somebody else in. And when they dug them up, they found that they were all bloated, right? And so and sometimes when they dug them up, the body would actually, because of changes that were going on naturally, the body would actually sit up in the grave when they pulled the dirt off of it. So you can imagine if you're in, 1350 Romania and you've dug Boris up out of his grave, and all of a sudden he sits up. And also you might, if you know anything about bodies after they die, your mouth pulls away from your teeth. So not only did Boris sit up, he was like that also. And I might throw, there was a king in Romania that was very bloody, and his name was Vlad. And one of the things he liked to do was to impale his enemies. He would stick a big stick, a big post up your rear end and lift you up, and you would just hang there, and gravity would cause your body to slide down this pole. And they did it this way so you wouldn't die immediately. It'd take you a long time. Well, anyway, between Vlad and all these bodies that they dug up acting strangely, that gave the idea. That's where the genesis of the vampire came from. And then when there was a Scottish author that was writing a book, and he focused in on Vlad, and he also talked about this vampire legend, and the book that he wrote was called Dracula. And so that's where all that comes from. So that has nothing to do with psychology.
It's just interesting.
I just thought it was funny. All right, back to psychology. If we move into about the 1700s, I want to talk just real briefly about three different countries: France, England, and Germany. And we're still talking about knowledge, and we're talking about probably the term the mind has shown up by now. And so the question was, among all these different kinds of philosophers, what does your mind do? What exactly is that? Okay, the French thought that the mind was basically non-existent. They didn't talk about that at all. So they didn't deal with that concept. The English thought that the English philosophers, I'll do it that way, probably Joe Blow selling fish and chips on the corner didn't care one way or the other. But English philosophers viewed the mind as being passive. It was there, but it didn't do anything directly. Germans, on the other hand, believed the mind was an active entity. So French, non-existent, basically. English, the mind is passive. The German is active. It actually does something. An example of an early French philosopher was a guy by the name of Montaigne. And since I didn't, I'll just spell it for you. Montaigne. The French have too many letters for the way they pronounce their words. So this is Montaigne. And his philosophy was skepticism. And the root of skepticism was to doubt everything. That there is no truth. And if you think you know the truth, then you are snobby, stuck up, so forth, so on, because there is no such thing. And so the net result of Montaigne's philosophy was to doubt everything. It was I guess it'd be pretty much like Plato in that anything from your senses, don't trust it. Okay, so keep that in mind, and we'll go to another French philosopher whose last name was Descartes, which is Descartes, Descartes. He was always, now I won't say anything about Descartes before the horse, but anyway, at some point in his career, he set out to disprove Montaigne. I mean, I don't know whether to say to try to show that it was true. basically what he was doing, he was saying, okay, this is what Montaigne's philosophy is. Let's follow this out as far as we can follow it out. And I'm sure it didn't come across the way it would in my class in Stephenville in 2017, but it was something like this. I doubt this desk. Can't trust that. I doubt I'm looking at him. I doubt that computer's over there. I doubt this. I doubt that. I doubt that. I doubt this. I doubt. You see where I'm going. And then he finally stops and says, well, what is the only thing that I'm not doubting? And the thing was, I'm doing it. And so he came up with that phrase, I think, therefore I am. And so that's how he disproved skepticism. By the fact that you are thinking, that demonstrates that you are. And so that disproved this skepticism approach. So Descartes went along and established, he was very non-French because if you remember what I said a little while ago, the French in general believed that the mind was a non-entity. But Descartes was different. He did believe in the mind. In fact, his philosophy is referred to as dualistic because he talked about the mind and the body.
Didn't he have the brain in the fish tank philosophy of, somebody could be potentially, which I think is kind of stupid, but somebody could be potentially sitting and toying with your mind and just poking it basically, and that's what reality is for us.
No, his deal. I didn't mean to reject you out of hand.
Oh, it's all good.
That was a very
No.
That was a very non-student oriented comment. Shit, no. Man. What he thought, he had all of our instincts and behaviors classified, and he said, you got appetitive stuff, like eating, drinking, sex, all that kind of business. You had this kind of stuff, and you had thinking, and these things down here were part of the body, but this thinking part, that was part of the mind, and the mind was more like God. He was also religious. And he believed that they were literally two distinct things, but they interacted through a little gland that we have in our brains called the pineal gland. And all these ideas he had turned out to be real important, although they were all false, but they were still important in the way things developed. He also suggested, he knew about nerve fibers. I don't even want to tell you how these guys knew about stuff like that, but he knew about nerve fibers. He thought they were filled with animal spirits. He thought they operated hydraulically. And he got this idea from statues at a park, I guess in Paris, that moved around based on water being pumped around inside the statue. So he thought the human body operated that way, and that these nerve fibers were filled with this animal spirit. And I'm not going to go into it today because, like I said, this is a whole class shrunk into an hour. But all his ideas about biology served as a stimulus for people who actually investigated the human body and made discoveries about how our bodies actually worked. But if it hadn't been for Descartes, probably that whole thing would have been delayed because these ideas would not have been out there.
I don't mean to be a snot, but I just looked up the brain in the fish
Okay.
tank scenario,
I
and
don't
it was
think you're a
by
snot.
Descartes.
Okay, I just say you're a double snot. That's fine. I had never heard, I had not personally heard of that.
Brain in the vat is actually what it said on here, but anyways, thought
I'm
I'd
not-
enlighten the class.
Okay, that's fine. Descartes was all the philosophy that developed from Descartes was called rationalism. And if you've ever, I don't know, I'll tell you what it's like. Have you ever taken geometry? Anybody? Okay, geometry basically, all you do is you solve things. And you start off in geometry with 3 or 4, they're not called givens, but I'm going to call them that because I can't remember the words. It's been 50 years since I said it. But you start off with these givens. I know one of them is an infinite number of lines can be passed through a single point. Another one is a straight line can be defined by 2 points. Okay, so you start with things like that, and then your teacher will say, okay, here's a triangle, prove it. And so you have to go back to all this stuff, and you'll go, if this is true, then this is true. If this is true, then that's true. And lo and behold, you've now formulated a triangle. And then you can use that for other stuff. Well, that's rationalism. You've got to start with some pre-existing things. And based on those pre-existing ideas, then you prove new things. And we still kind of do this research today because, like, if Dr. Falkenberry gets one experiment and he gets these findings, he'll then say, well, if this is true, then this must be true also. And so then that's using rationalism. And so the idea of rationalism came from Rene Descartes. So did calculus, I think. So he was an important figure.
Pretty smart.
All right, so we got French with the blank mind except for Descartes. Let's talk about the English. They had the passive mind. One of the English philosophers that I had on my list, John Locke. John Locke believed that the mind at birth was a blank slate. And in Latin, that was a tabula rasa. So if you encounter tabula rasa, that's what we're talking about. Well, Locke believed that through experience, things are imprinted upon your mind. The mind doesn't actively do anything, it's a receptacle for experiences. And then another importance as far as psychology is concerned, these things become associated. So you can associate these experiences to create more complex experiences. And one of the other forms of learning, one of the early forms of learning theory was called associationism, which is a direct descendant from this idea from John Locke. So John Locke believed that your mental events were due to these experiences that you got through day-to-day activities. And this philosophy was called empiricism. And this is really what modern science is based on, observation and acquiring information through observation. I got two other people before I go on to the Germans. Another early empiricist in this case, he was British. I think he was actually from Scotland, but they all run together, literally. Anyway, this guy's name is George Berkeley. Berkeley believed that existence depended upon experience. I may not have said that correctly, but that's my story and I'm sticking with it. In other words, what he really said was things don't exist unless you are experiencing them. So his little motto in English was, I perceive, therefore I am. You youngsters may not have ever heard about this, but people used to ask this stupid question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, did it really fall? Berkeley's answer was no, because none of it existed unless there's somebody there to perceive it. And then somebody would ask Berkeley, well, how, I know that education building's over there without looking at it. How does that happen? Well, Berkeley was also religious, and he said God sees everything. And because God sees everything, then things exist, even though I personally don't see it. All right, one last, I think this one, I'm not sure about this person. I gotta throw in women. Another empiricistic, there weren't many women. When I teach history of psych, I can go weeks without ever mentioning a single female. Because, and I'll tell you why, I will give you one possible reason. But this one's name is, I love this person, Mary Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft. All right, she was a philosopher probably in the 1700s. And she wrote a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And she argued in her book that women need to acquire strength, both of mind and body, and to ignore the labels that were given to women back in the day, because all of those labels tended to be associated with weakness. So if you looked at a description of the perfect woman in 1750, it probably would be a lot of descriptors that you would go, that's weak, you know. Well, you weren't supposed to be working, you weren't supposed to be doing that, da-da-da. Anyway, so she argued against that. She was disregarded, and I have a book in my office that says the way that you disregard the writings of women is that you call them ugly names, like bitch, or you impugn their intelligence, or you say they're crazy, you know, so you can say their mental health is off. So all of the other philosophers, most of the other philosophers of her day characterized her in all these ways. So she was not an extremely popular philosopher during her time. So why did I even mention her? She had 2 daughters. One daughter committed suicide, but the other daughter, who was named Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, married an English poet named Percy Bysshe Shelley. And so this daughter's name became Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And she wrote a book. And she wrote a book about the creation of life that's entitled Frankenstein. And in her book, she incorporates her mother's philosophy somehow or another. So now you've learned about vampires, Dracula, and Frankenstein, all in 45 minutes.
It's good for Halloween.
I know, perfect. All right, in my remaining time, let's talk about the Germans. The Germans were the third group of philosophers, and they believed in an active mind. Well, if there's an active mind, then it can be measured. If it's actually doing something, you can figure out ways to measure it. And so in the 1800s, a procedure referred to as psychophysics developed. And without going into great detail, psychophysics basically was the idea I'd present you a stimulus and then I would measure your response. So I could say, all right, I'm going to turn this light on, you tell me whether you see it or not. And then I could vary how bright the light was. And that was the idea behind psychophysics. One of the psychophysicists was a person whose last name was, I'm going to say Weber so you could spell it. In Germany it would be Weber, but it's W-E-B-E-R. And he established ideas for what was called the absolute threshold and the just noticeable difference. You know, supposedly your absolute threshold for light would be a candle on the moon on a dark, clear night. That you ought to be able to see that 1/2 the time. So if there was some idiot on the moon holding a candle for 100 nights, if you saw the candle 50 of those 100 nights, then that would be just noticeable difference. That would be the absolute threshold. Just noticeable difference is being able to tell the difference between two things about half the time. One of his students was a guy named Fechner, F-E-C-H-N-E-R. And he also studied thresholds. Are y'all familiar with a compass? Okay. There's part of your body that I can get a compass and I can just drag it down your body and it'll feel like that the ends of the compass are spreading out. There are other parts of your body that I can do the same thing, but it appears to you that they're moving in together. and it depends upon the sensitivity of that area of your skin. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff that Fechner studied. Another German was von Helmholtz. And these were all early psychophysicists. Von Helmholtz studied vision and hearing. Now you guys are capstone seniors, so I'm going to ask you a question, and I expect you to know. What did Helmholtz discover? What did he propose about vision? It is something to do with you as humans that other creatures do not possess. You have a vision attribute, we do as humans, but my dog Lucy does not. I can see things that she can't see. I'm not going anywhere, am I?
Is it a perception that you can have?
I guess, I don't know. I'll cut to the chase, I'm running out of time. Color. We can see color, dogs can't see color. And von Helmholtz is the person who proposed the trichromatic theory of color vision. In Stephenville English, that means the three color. And those would be blue, green, and red. So, all right. Running out of time. Another German philosopher, all these guys are basically philosophers. And that reminds me of another aside. Her degree and my degree and most other people's degree say Doctor of Philosophy, even though we are psychologists. Does anybody know why most everybody at this university has a Doctor of Philosophy?
Philosophy was like the main.
Yeah, back in the day, everybody was a philosopher. And so when you got a doctoral degree, the only doctoral degrees were like medicine, something else, and philosophy. And so people got doctors of philosophy. See, we're stuck in the Middle Ages, folks. All this academia stuff derives from that. Well, all right. So another philosopher, German, this guy's name was Wundt, and it's W-U-N-D-T. Now he studied with Weber, so this is a direct academic lineage from in this psychophysics idea. Well, the reason why I mentioned Wundt, there's a lot of things I could say, but this is going to be the most important thing. In about 1855, somewhere in through there, he established a laboratory at the University of Leipzig. And this was the very first laboratory set aside for the study of psychological phenomena. So this was the first psychological lab. Now you notice I have not, in my hour of this class, I have not mentioned an American one time. So as we get to the end, let me throw some stuff out. A man by the name of William James studied with Wundt in Germany. And he established a psychological laboratory at Harvard University. A British philosopher whose last name was Titchener studied with Weber. Couldn't get a job in England and was hired at the University of Cornell, or Cornell University in upstate New York. And he established a psychological laboratory at Cornell. Can't think of it. Another early laboratory, now I've gone blank. So the Columbia got a laboratory, the University of Chicago got a laboratory. And so psychology spread to the United States, basically from Weber's lab to Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, University of Chicago, eventually University of Texas, University of Kansas, University of California, at where's the main campus, the big campus? It's in Berkeley. And Berkeley, California is named after George Berkeley. See, all you can learn. Now you've learned about vampires, geography, Frankenstein, all in a single hour. There's an interesting program, and I thought about it, but then I thought it might take too time. Dr. Robertson and I can get this program, I think on Google or something, and you can put in the person who directed your dissertation, and it'll give you a lineage tree of academically who you were descended from. And so, like, I know my supervising professor studied with a guy named Benton Underwood, who studied with a guy named Clark Hull, who studied from a guy, and I can work my way back to probably Weber and James and those people, because my degree is not very far away from all this founding stuff, because I'm, ancient. But anyway, those are the things that I thought might catch you up. Some of the highlights of history of psych that might help you a little bit on your upcoming test. So, do y'all have any questions? Expedition unknown.
Do you have a good handle on psychotherapy, Freud, all that history?
Let me throw that. She mentioned a good word. Sigmund Freud. Do y'all know where he was born and raised initially in his early life?
Germany.
Austria. According to Adolf Hitler, they're the same country. So the Austrians are first cousins to the Germans, and so he was Germanic. And I want to go back to what was the concept of the mind with regard to the Germans? Passive, active, or non-existent? It's active. It's an active mind. Okay. Think about Freud's theory. What is your mind doing? It's got that unconscious, doesn't it? And that unconscious is directing your behavior. Everything you do, according to Freud, the part of your mind that you have no awareness of is down there causing you to act the way you do. I'll give you an analogy. Are you all familiar with geysers? Where's a good place in the United States you can go to see a geyser? Anyone?
Yellowstone.
Okay, yeah, Yellowstone. If you don't know, a geyser is hot water that comes shooting up out of the ground. Okay, and so like there's one in Yellowstone called Old Faithful, because about every 30 minutes it erupts. All right, take that as your behavior. So why is that? What causes that water to get hot, and what causes that water to erupt? Well, in Yellowstone, this is something to think about, is one humongous volcano. I mean, when that dog goes, everybody from there to Dallas is going to have a real crappy day. Okay? But all that hot, heat, molten rock is under the surface, but it causes things to happen on the surface. And that's kind of the way Freud saw the way your mind works. This unconscious is like that molten rock, and then all these little vents, like a geyser, are due to what that molten rock is doing. And so if you can imagine your mind like that, the unconscious part is pushing you off in certain directions to meet certain needs that it has, then I guess in relation to what I was talking about today, that's another example of a German person emphasizing the active mind that they all believed in. And Freud was pretty much an academic descendant from these people Weber and some other associates back in the 1850s. And the deal with Freud's therapy was to let you know what's going on down there. Anything? How do you see your mind? Do you ever sit and think about that?
Contemplate.
Do you ever contemplate your mind? I saw another philosopher that stated that really yourself is a bunch of passing thoughts. So I mean, if you stop and think about it, then what you might do is your whole existence are just these, I won't say random, but they're different thoughts, different emotions, different feelings that just, like a cloud, they pass across your consciousness and you think about it for a little bit. Sometimes they make you uncomfortable, sometimes they make you do this, but really that's sort of what yourself is standing. You can actually stand back and watch all this stuff play in your consciousness.
It's called meta.
Huh?
It's meta.
Yeah.
Metacognition, thinking about your thinking.
All right, I shot through my hour.
Woo-hoo.
Ooh,
Thank you.
you're welcome. All right, last chance for questions.
Yeah. Ask them because there are questions on the history of psychology on the major field test. About 7% of your test is history of psychology. Make sure you remember names, dates. Do you need to know how psychology branched out into the United States? Who were the leaders? You feel like you got a good handle on those things?
Do y'all remember from, I think this might help you, do you remember from like general psych or some of your early courses that in the United States we had structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, Gestalt came from Germany, psychoanalysis came from Germany, but those were, I know in general psych books they call them the 5 early schools of thought and psychology, and they basically related to the United States. Yankee scored again. They basically relate to the United States and the different approaches that psychologists took in the United States. And there's a person who I did not mention that I probably should have that had a great effect on the U.S. psychology, and that was Charles Darwin. So I suspect it would be a good idea for you to have some idea about Darwin's basics.
You mind going over the difference between structuralism and functionalism?
Structuralism studied, the idea behind it was to study the structure of the mind. And this, remember I mentioned, I don't know, you may not remember, I mentioned a guy named Titchener that founded a laboratory at Cornell. He was the resident structuralist in the United States. And they would his lab would try to break a mental event down into thoughts, emotions, and sensations, something along those lines. So he'd get a big hat pin and stick you in the hand, and you weren't supposed to say ouch. You were supposed to say what you were thinking, what you were feeling, and things like that. Functionalism was a derivative of basically evolution, and the idea was, what is the function of this trait? So, like emotion, how does it function? And the person who founded this approach was William James. And he even had a theory, well, this might be on the test, he had a theory of emotion called the James Lange theory that says you act first and then you emotion later. So back to Yellowstone, if I'm walking through Yellowstone and I come around the corner and I see a grizzly bear, according to James, I do not become afraid and then run. I run, and while I'm running, I ask myself, why am I running? And I come back with, because I'm doing this, I must be afraid. It's just the exact opposite of what you'd think. So anyway, James and functionalism. A psychologist was studying psychology, a doctoral degree at the University of Chicago, and he was using rats in his dissertation study. And the idea at the University of Chicago was to go into the mind of your subject and say, what were they thinking when they were doing this study? And this psychologist thought this was the most stupid thing he'd ever heard of, because you can't ask a rat to tell you what's on its mind. And so after he graduated, he wrote an essay about the stupidity of mental events, that they really didn't exist, and that all you can study is behavior. And this guy's name was John B. Watson. And he was the founder of behaviorism. A guy named Wertheimer founded Gestalt psychology. And then, folks, who founded psychoanalysis? Freud, yeah. Who came up with the idea of the archetype? These are just random historical facts now.
Yeah, but they're good.
Much like what you'll find on the test. One of Freud's students developed an idea. He called it the collective unconscious. And in the collective unconscious were these things called archetypes. Anybody have any idea who that was? Okay, his last name wasn't Old, it was not Old, but Jung. Yeah, Jung, yeah. J-U-N-G. Carl Jung.
Y'all love Young. Big Five.
A circle represents an archetype. So according to Jung, all cultures have things that represent like eternity or long lasting, and they are all represented by circles. What do we give each other when we theoretically sign on for life? A ring, and it's a circle, yeah. So.
Theoretically sign on for life.
I said theoretically sign on for life. You may sign on for life more than once. What else? Hierarchy of needs. Maslow.
What was Watson's famous experiment?
Albert.
Little Albert.
This won't be on the test. What was the relationship between Watson and his graduate assistant, Rosalie Rayner?
Inappropriate.
Yes. It was inappropriate, and it got Watson fired from Johns Hopkins, and he never got back into academia. He worked in advertising in New York City for the rest of his career, but never could get back into academia. Because this was like in 1920, and people of Baltimore took a dim view of this whole deal.
He got Harvey Weinsteined in the 20s.
Yes, yeah, that's pretty much the case. The sad thing about that, the comment though, is that probably it didn't stop that behavior from happening. It just came down on him in particular. So maybe we're moving now in a day where I don't know. I haven't, we won't go, anyway, you're right. But that is an untold part of that whole classical conditioning fear deal, in that there was more going on between the two of them than just working together, training this little kid to be scared to death of rats. And the other thing you might want to know about that is they didn't desynthesize him. Now he's got to be dead by now, but when I was in graduate school, I always assumed somewhere in the United States there was an old man that when he saw a rat just freaked out. Yeah.
Actually, I think one of my classes looked it up, and they think they know who Little Albert was. He was a kid from an orphanage, and they think he died of encephalitis at like 8.
Yeah. Saw a rat and got scared to death.
Brain swelling.
Caused his autoimmune system to
Shut
quit working.
down, right?
But on that major field achievement test, I would expect some questions about Freud. I'd expect some questions about Jung.
What about Rogers?
Carl Rogers probably. Just remember touchy-feely and you'll do real good with Carl Rogers.
Wundt.
Wundt will probably be there. Fechner might be there. Weber might be there.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mention it, but there's a law called Weber's Law, and that sometimes shows up on things like this. Alfred Adler might, in that touchy-feely part of psychology, Alfred Adler might show up. What you might want to remember about Alfred Adler is striving for superiority. I suspect Jung would be there. Horney might be there. That's Horney, but you say Horney.
What'd she do? And it's a woman.
It's a woman.
Yay!
She demasculinized Freud's theory. I mean, you guys may not remember, but the Oedipal complex, Freud had an explanation for women, but it was kind of shaky. And Horney kind of reinterpreted all that and gave more credence to issues in women. I'm just trying to think. Other than Watson, I don't know about many other. I don't know any other behavioral type people that would be general enough to ask a question in like this major field achievement test. If you were taking a test over, I know one. Something about Thorndike might show up. Mm-hmm. And a quickie on Thorndike. Thorndike established what was called the law of effect. And I can talk about that in my graduate class tonight. When things are followed by a pleasant outcome, they tend to be repeated. If things are followed by a negative outcome, they tend to be avoided. So that was sort of the basis for the psychology of learning, and so that might show up on the test.
Terman? You think Terman will show up?
I don't know about Terman, Binet. Terman, by the way, is that now we've crossed into testing, and Binet would be there. Mm-hmm. I suspect. Binet's the one that did the first. Actually, it was not an IQ test. It was an intelligence. It was to test intelligence, but it was not called IQ. Terman and his associates are the ones that were referred to as the IQ test, because they developed the formula that formula that mental age divided by chronological age. And they, by the way, were at what university? You know what we call that test in the United States? Now this could be on it.
Yeah.
Okay, it's called the Stanford-Binet test. And the Stanford comes from Stanford University, and that's where all the Americans were located that worked on Binet's test to Americanize it. Because after all, it was originally written in. What language was it originally written in? Where was where was Alfred Binet? Yeah, he was in France, so it would have been in French.
Yeah.
And so it wouldn't have flown in the United States because nobody could speak French. Nobody I know.
I know.
Any other testers? The other thing about testing, I know, are pretty picky, and I would hate to be you and see something about Army Alpha and Army Beta. I would not. They were two tests that were developed by World War I, and I hate to say this, the primary purpose of them was to show that blacks were not as smart as whites. And they used them as a way to keep blacks out of the Army in World War I. So psychologists are not immune to the same discriminatory actions that everybody else is. We were hesitant. This is an irony, folks. We were hesitant to allow women into the discipline. Now look around. This is what happens when you let women do something. They take over.
Last chance. No. All right. So I will see y'all at 7 tonight in Math 333. Let's get our study on. Get ready to go.
Later, guys.
Thank you. Thanks,
Welcome.
Dr. Newby.